Welcome back to the Mad Genius Thesis. Um, the show where we kind of dig into that whole is creativity and mental illness like connected thing.
Yeah, yeah.
And today we're going to really dive into a book called The Insanity Hoax, Exposing the Myth of the Mad Genius by Judith Schlesinger.
Yeah. It's fascinating stuff.
Yeah, and I'm really excited to unpack it with you. So let's jump right in.
Sounds good.
This idea of the mad genius.
Yeah.
It's like everywhere, right?
It really is. It's like it's baked into how we think about creativity. Like Schlesinger starts the book with this quote by Anatole Breard,
Okay.
and he just perfectly captures that stereotype of the crazy musician, the one who stays up all night, forgets to pay their bills, is just like living on the edge.
Yeah, totally. And it makes you wonder how much of that is just like romanticized,
Oh,
right?
absolutely. It seeds right into that myth.
And it's not even just musicians, right? We see this with like any creative person who's a little bit different.
Great. Like they almost have to be a little bit off to be considered genius.
Exactly. Like think about Beethoven, Billie Holiday, Charlie Parker.
Yeah.
Their struggles become like part of their whole artistic persona.
It's almost like their personal struggles validate their art in a way.
Yeah. It's strange. And what's interesting is that even reality TV plays into this.
Oh, totally.
Like shows like American Idol, it's all glitz and glam, but there's this underlying fascination with that train wreck potential.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Like we're drawn to watching someone with talent struggle or even like crash and burn.
Right. It's like we almost expect it.
Yeah. And it kind of reinforces that idea that brilliance has a price,
Totally. But then you have these studies that are like linking creativity and mental illness. Like I've even seen stuff reported on the BBC and like Harvard's website.
Right. And that makes it seem like there's this scientific backing to the whole thing.
Right.
But that's where things get really interesting because Schlesinger digs into those studies.
Okay.
And she argues that the science might not be as solid as we think.
Really?
She points out the influence of pharmaceutical companies in all of this.
Oh, right.
They have a vested interest in promoting the idea that mental illness is like super common.
Well, yeah. I mean, if they're selling the solutions, they want there to be a problem to solve.
Exactly. And some of these studies rely on anecdotal evidence or small sample sizes or self-reporting.
Right.
Yeah.
Doesn't it make it hard to draw like strong conclusions?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It raises a lot of questions about how we're interpreting the data and whether it actually supports this link between creativity and mental illness.
So it's not as simple as we might think.
Nope, not at all.
And then there's this whole system of how we diagnose mental illness,
Right.
which Schlesinger really takes to task. I mean, she focuses on the DSM, which is like the go-to manual for mental health professionals.
Yeah, it's kind of the Bible of psychiatry.
Right. So is it really like the ultimate authority that we think it is?
Well, that's what Schlesinger challenges. She points out that the DSM has grown exponentially over the years.
Okay. How so?
Like in the 50s, there were only like 60 categories of mental disorders.
Wow.
Now there are over 300. That's a huge jump.
Yeah. So it raises the question, are we over-medicalizing normal behavior?
Like, are we turning everyday quirks into mental illnesses?
Exactly. And how much do things like financial incentives play into those decisions?
Right. Like insurance companies or pharmaceutical companies all have a stake in how we label and treat these conditions.
It's a complex landscape for sure, and it's something we need to be really aware of as we navigate these conversations about creativity and mental health.
Definitely. So we've got the science, the diagnostic tools, money all mixed up in this.
It's a tangled web.
No wonder there's so many misinterpretations.
It's crucial to approach all of this with nuance. We can't just take these ideas at face value, especially when they have such a big impact on how we view both creativity and mental health.
For sure. And speaking of how we view things, let's talk about how the media shapes our perceptions.
Oh, yeah. They love a good tortured artist story.
It's like catnip for them.
Like, remember the movie Shine about the pianist David Helfgott?
Oh, yeah.
While it was a captivating film, it really played up that torture genius angle.
It did. And his family actually disputed how accurate it was.
Right. And it's not just movies. Even documentaries and educational programs can perpetuate these stereotypes.
Like that PBS special, A Brilliant Madness.
Exactly. It's everywhere.
It's wild how pervasive it is.
Yeah.
And it's not just in the classical music world either.
You're right. The jazz world is full of those live fast, die young stories.
Yeah, with all the improvisation and, the kind of lifestyles associated with jazz.
It just seems to lend itself to these romanticized portrayals of the troubled artist.
Right. Like we're almost conditioned to see creativity and instability as intertwined.
Yeah, it's a powerful narrative.
But what about those moments of intense creative output?
Yeah.
Could those be mistaken for signs of mental illness?
No, that's a really interesting point.
Like what looks like mania to one person could be a breakthrough for another.
Exactly. Schlesinger suggests that what we might interpret as a mental health issue could actually be part of the creative process itself.
So instead of pathologizing something, maybe we should be looking at it through a different lens.
Right. Context matters. We can't just look at a list of symptoms and make assumptions. We have to understand the individual, the situation, the bigger picture.
That's a really powerful point. It challenges us to look beyond those easy labels and dig a little deeper.
And that's what we'll continue to do in the next part of our deep dive.
Can't wait. We've just scratched the surface here, and I'm already seeing things in a whole new light.
Me too. It's going to be an interesting conversation.
Stay tuned, listeners. This is just getting good.
Absolutely.
It's amazing how much history and culture shapes how we see things, even creativity.
It's true. Schlesinger really makes that point. Like, take the Romantic era, for example.
Okay.
It totally romanticized that whole image of the tortured artist.
Mm-hmm.
Like, suffering equals genius.
Right. The brooding poets, the passionate painters, all consumed by angst.
Yeah, and that image has stuck with us.
It really has. I mean, even today, we still connect deep emotion and struggle with creative brilliance.
It's like we need that dramatic backstory to explain the mystery of creativity.
But it's been centuries since the Romantic era. Why do you think that image is so enduring?
That's a good question. I think it taps into something fundamental about how we perceive creativity. It's mysterious, it's powerful, and maybe we feel like it needs an equally dramatic origin story.
That's interesting. And Schlesinger also talks about the rise of psychoanalysis in the mid-20th century.
Right. All that talk about the unconscious hidden desires, childhood trauma.
Yeah.
It provided this whole new framework for understanding or maybe even explaining away the creative process.
It's like psychoanalysis gave us a new language for talking about creative people.
And maybe a way to justify their unconventional behavior.
Right. But then we fast forward to today, and there's this huge emphasis on self-esteem and avoiding failure.
Right. Like everyone gets a trophy.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Could that be influencing how we see creative individuals too?
Absolutely. It could be contributing to this perception that creative people are fragile, sensitive, need to be protected.
Like they can't handle the real world.
Yeah. It's kind of ironic when you think about it. We put them on a pedestal for their talent, but also treat them as if they're somehow less capable.
It's like we're both celebrating and marginalizing them at the same time.
That's a great point.
But, Schlesinger doesn't just point out the problems with this whole perspective.
Right.
She also offers some alternative ways of looking at the relationship between creativity and mental health.
She does. And this is where things get really fascinating.
Okay, I'm all ears.
So, for instance, she discusses the work of Albert Rothenberg,
Okay.
who spent years researching creativity.
Mm-hmm.
And he found that the main thing that set creative people apart wasn't mental illness.
What was it then?
Motivation.
Oh, wow. So it's not about being crazy. It's about being driven.
Exactly. It's that burning desire to create, to explore, to express oneself. It's what fuels that constant pursuit of artistic expression.
I can definitely relate to that. When I'm passionate about a project, I get totally absorbed.
It's a powerful force.
It is.
Yeah.
And didn't Schlesinger also talk about a historiometric approach?
Yes. She highlights the work of Dean Keith Simonton, who uses statistical analysis to understand creativity.
Okay, so like data crunching.
Yeah, he analyzes data about historical figures and creative output.
Interesting.
Yeah.
But even with all that data, there's still no easy answer, right?
Right. Even Simonton himself acknowledges the limitations of his approach.
So we're still left with this question. If the link between creativity and mental illness is so shaky, why does the myth persist?
That's a good question. Why do we cling to it so tightly?
Yeah, why?
Well, Schlesinger suggests that maybe it's because the mad genius myth lets us experience the thrill of creativity without the risk.
Okay, I like that. It's like watching a high-wire act from the safety of the audience.
Exactly. We get the excitement without the danger.
But isn't there also a bit of hero worship involved?
Oh, absolutely. We elevate creative people to this almost mythical status.
Right, and maybe their talent seems so powerful, so otherworldly, that we try to explain it away as something abnormal or out of control.
Yeah. The mad genius myth lets us admire them while also keeping them at a distance.
Right. It's like we can acknowledge their brilliance, but also reassure ourselves that we're somehow different, more normal.
It's a way to protect our own egos, maybe.
That's interesting. But what about all those historical examples of creative people who really did struggle?
Mm-hmm.
Like Beethoven, He's practically the poster boy for the mad genius.
And Schlesinger actually uses Beethoven to show how tricky it can be to apply modern diagnoses to figures from the past.
I see what you mean. Like, how do we separate his deafness, his poverty, his relationship problems from his artistic genius?
Exactly. Can we really know how much his struggles influenced his creative process?
It's like trying to diagnose someone from centuries ago based on, like, scraps of information.
Right, and it's all filtered through the lens of our own time and understanding.
So it's nearly impossible to be truly objective.
Schlesinger reminds us that we need to be cautious about those retrospective diagnoses. We can't just impose our modern ideas about mental health onto the past.
We might be looking for evidence to support the myth instead of really evaluating the facts.
It's a trap we can easily fall into.
You know what I'd really love to know?
What's that?
What do musicians themselves think about all of this?
Ah, that's a great question. And Schlesinger includes those perspectives, too.
She does.
She quotes musicians like Wainwright Tuck Andrus, Claire Fisher,
Okay.
and they offer some really insightful reflections on what it's actually like to live a life dedicated to music.
It's one thing to theorize about creativity, but it's a whole other thing to hear from the people who are actually doing it.
Right. They give us a glimpse behind the curtain, so to speak.
So what did they say?
They talk about the challenges, the rewards, the misconceptions. It's not all glamorous concerts and adoring fans.
Right. There's a lot more to it than that.
Yeah, they talk about the financial instability, the constant pressure to perform, the critical scrutiny.
It sounds pretty intense.
It can be. And they acknowledge that this kind of environment can take a toll on anyone's mental health.
Do they talk about the mad genius stereotype directly?
They do. Some admit that they might play into that persona at times, kind of use it to their advantage.
But others reject it completely.
Exactly. They see it as a harmful myth that trivializes both their work and the struggles of people with mental illness.
So there's a range of views within the music community itself.
Absolutely. It's not a one-size-fits-all situation.
But if we're going to move away from this whole mad genius idea, what are we left with?
Right. What is the relationship between creativity and mental health if it's not about one causing the other?
That's the million-dollar question.
And it's a question that leads us to some of Schlesinger's most profound insights.
Ooh, okay. I'm intrigued.
She encourages us to see this not as a binary, but as a complex interplay of individual traits, experiences, and societal perceptions.
Okay, I'm definitely hooked. Now I really can't wait for the next part.
It's where all the pieces start to come together.
Listeners, stay with us. We're about to get to the good stuff. All right, so we're back and ready to wrap up our deep dive into Judith Schlesinger's The Insanity Hoax. We've spent the last two parts like really picking apart this whole myth. The science, the diagnoses, how the media plays into it all.
It's been quite the journey.
It has. And we've learned that the link between creativity and mental illness is a lot more complex than just,
Right.
a simple mad genius story.
It's not just a one-to-one correlation.
Exactly. But now I'm kind of wrestling with this question of, if it's not a straightforward link, then how do we explain all the challenges that creative people often face?
Right.
They're often seen as more sensitive,
Right.
more intense, maybe even a little bit different.
And that's where Schlesinger's insights really resonate. She suggests that instead of automatically jumping to mental illness as the explanation, maybe we should consider those qualities as part of the creative personality itself.
Okay, so like those traits we talked about before.
Right. Self-discipline, tenacity, strong self-image.
Yeah, those are actually more common in creative people than we might think.
It kind of flips that stereotype of the unstable artist on its head.
So are you saying that those same traits that fuel their creativity could also make them more vulnerable?
Exactly. Think about it. Heightened sensitivity, relentless drive, that ability to see the world in a unique way.
Yeah.
Those can be both strengths and sources of struggle, especially in a world that doesn't always embrace people who are different.
It's like they're constantly balancing on this edge between brilliance and burnout.
Right. Always pushing those boundaries, dealing with those expectations.
And that can take a toll on anyone's mental health.
Absolutely. But it's especially important to understand the unique pressures that creative individuals face.
Because they often challenge the status quo.
Exactly. And that can lead to feelings of isolation and misunderstanding, like they don't belong.
And those feelings can definitely impact mental well-being if they're not addressed.
For sure. But here's a key point that Schlesinger makes.
Okay.
She argues that those challenges aren't inherent to creativity itself. It's more about how society reacts to those who are different.
So it's not the creativity that's the problem, it's the context.
Right. If we want to support both creativity and mental health, we need to foster a culture that celebrates originality, embraces diversity, and provides support for those who are struggling.
It's about creating a space where creativity can thrive.
Exactly.
But let's be real for a second.
Okay.
We can't just throw out the DSM and expect everything to be fine.
Right. Mental illness is a real issue and people need help.
Exactly. And Schlesinger acknowledges that.
She does. She's not denying the existence of mental illness.
But she is advocating for a more nuanced and compassionate approach to mental health care.
Right. One that takes into account individual experiences, cultural influences, and the specific challenges that creative individuals face.
So it's about moving beyond those strict labels and diagnoses.
Seeing the whole person, not just a list of symptoms.
And recognizing that creative expression itself can be a source of healing and resilience.
Absolutely. It can be a powerful tool for connecting with ourselves and with others.
I love that. Instead of seeing creativity as a symptom of illness, maybe it can be a pathway to well-being.
That's a really powerful reframing.
It is. It gives me hope.
Me too.
So what can our listeners take away from this deep dive into the Insanity Hoax?
That's a good question.
I think Schlesinger is asking us to really examine those deeply held beliefs about creativity and mental illness.
To look beyond those sensationalized stories and those romanticized images.
To see the complexity, the humanity behind it all.
To remember that creative individuals are just that, individuals, each with their own unique story.
And to work towards creating a world where their creativity is celebrated, not feared or dismissed.
A world where they can truly flourish.
Beautifully said. I think that's the perfect note to end on.
I agree.
So thank you for joining us on this exploration of the Insanity Hoax. We hope it's given you some new insights and maybe even inspired you to embrace your own creative spirit.
Keep creating, keep exploring, and remember, you don't have to be mad to be a genius.
See you next time.